Media Center Ukraine Forum continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko. Today is November 14. It is a tragic date in the history of Meskhetian Turks. Stalin's regime deported this nation to Central Asia from their historic homeland, and after the World War II, some of the Meskhetians found their new home in Ukraine, but now we're facing the new enemy, the Russian Federation, and some of the places where the Meskhetian Turks live ended up either under occupation or in the area of active battles. So let's talk about the way the Meskhetian Turks live for the time being. So let me introduce our guest today. It's Ihor Lossovskyi, Deputy Head of the State Service for Ethnic Affairs and Freedom of Conscience; Sadyar Mamedov, Meskhetian civic activist; Serhiy Danilov, Deputy Director of the Association of Middle East Studies; and Ihor Semyvolos, Executive Director at the Association of Middle East Studies. And also about to join us is Danilo Radovilov, Deputy Director of the Krymsky Institute of Oriental Studies of the National Academy of Science of Ukraine. It's our pleasure to have you here. So let's start a conversation with Stalin's times, when the deportation of Meskhetian Turks had begun. So can you please tell us about those Stalin's crimes that started this terrible story? Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here. It's the day of commemoration of the events when commemoration of this day that happened 79 years ago, a difficult day for our people, when the Meskhetian Turks were deported to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan from the territory of modern Georgia by Stalin's regime. And we remember our grandparents telling us those stories that back then the soldiers, the former USSR, had come to 200 villages where we used to live. They prohibited people from even walking in the street. People were put in the railway cars and deported. Back then, many people have died because it was winter back then and they just froze to death. So they were riding in those railway cars for about 40 days. Sometimes they had nothing to eat, and in very difficult conditions they were making their way to those places. And as they come, very little number of them were left alive. We were told that the children were dying on the way, the elderly were dying on the way, because all of the youth was in the ranks of the Soviet army during World War II. About 50,000 of Meskhetian Turks were in the ranks of Soviet army. So we were hearing about that tragedy, we were hearing about all those difficulties that our people was coming through. And you know, I start getting goosebumps every time I'm hearing this. So today we commemorate 79 years of this tragedy that happened to our nation, and until this very day we cannot find a place where we could settle down, because some of them witnessed this deportation for a number of times. Probably some of you remember the events of the year 89 in Ferganska Valley, when there were conflicts between Meskhetian Turks and Uzbeks, which resulted in some of the Meskhetian Turks leaving. Some of them ended up in Russia, some of them remained in Kyrgyzstan, some of them ended up in Ukraine or other countries, and part of our Meskhetian Turks were living in Chaplinsky district of Kherson region. There were about 67,000 of them, and about 900 Meskhetian Turks in Kherson region in total. They were involved in agriculture mostly. Well, my people, I would say they are very industrious. They like working in the field on their land, and just as soon as they brought up their kids, as they rose up their kids, the work has started that was initiated by the aggressor, by Russian Federation, who again broke their homes, and they had to leave for Turkey or other European countries. Some of them left for United States, and again they cried out to the world that they need to come back to their home, to modern Georgia, from where we were ousted without retaining any of our rights. We were ousted from there without being asked, and we cannot come back to commemorate our history there, to commemorate our culture. So it's very difficult to even say about it, because I know my parents were dreaming that time would come when we come back to our homeland. And whenever our Meskhetian Turks leave, I want to wish them good health, and I want to say that today we're seeing a full-scale war going on in Ukraine, and for us it's an example of people fighting for their homeland, for their freedom. And I was always an activist in Ukraine. I am an ATO veteran myself. I was taking part in this today's war, but after a number of situations I was retired. I was with the National Guard of Ukraine in Kherson, and today, during this war, we see it as an example when Ukrainians make those courageous sacrifices, and we understand that now the war for freedom and homeland is the most important thing that people can do, and we hope that with this joint effort we take over our enemy, and Ukrainian people will help us in negotiations with our Georgian brothers, our Georgian partners, that we have this right to return to our homeland. And our people who continue living in Chaplinsky district of Kherson region, they are fatigued today because the enemy comes, they intimidate the people, they take away their belongings. They ended up in the middle of this war, and they don't know how to do, because or what to do, because if they do as the Russians say, because if they do as the Russians say, that will create negative attitude from Ukrainians. But if they don't want to do something, the Russians are unpredictable. So we hope the war ends soon and we will be able to come back to our homeland. Thank you very much, Mr. Ihor. How does Ukraine as a state helps the Meskhetian Turks affected by the war today? What is the support that they're getting? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm representing the National Service on Ethnic Affairs and Freedom of Conscience. It's the national body that formulates the state policy in this area. Well, the majority of population of Ukraine are ethnic Ukrainians, 80%. However, 20%, approximately 20% of our population are the representatives of national minorities, and they are multiple. According to the census, their number amounts to 130. Many different communities live in Ukraine, national ethnic communities which were suffering from the totalitarian Soviet state during the deportations of the 40th years of 20th century. Armenians from Crimea, Crimean Tatars, German, other nations, and among them Meskhetian Turks, who were deported in year 1944 by Stalin's regime to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, to Kazakhstan. However, it just didn't end over there. It's people who, within a life of one single person who may be of older age today, but they witnessed that deportation of the 40s years of the 20th century. I think that there are many people who are still alive who witnessed the need to leave their homes in Central Asia, where the civil war was going on. And today, during full-scale Russian aggression and occupation of Black Sea territories, which are currently inhabited by our Ukrainian Meskhetian Turks who moved to Ukraine from Central Asia, once again, many of them are forced to leave their homes. It's clear it's a significant load on the Ukrainian state. Many of them have become internally displaced persons. Many of them became refugees to the neighboring countries. We understand that probably their homes were destroyed in the occupied territories. Those who remained in occupied territories are subject to the repressions by the Russian occupational authorities, and Ukrainian government, to the best of its capabilities, tries to help such people, and we clearly understand that this situation will end as soon as the war ends, and this is when we will solve the problems with all those people coming back to Ukraine. Those who move to other regions of Ukraine, they will come back to their homes in Ukraine where they used to live before the beginning of the full-scale aggression. And I want to thank the community of Meskhetian Turks for remembering, for commemorating this 79th anniversary. Next year it will be a jubilee year. It's a sad jubilee, sad anniversary, so I think that the next year we will commemorate those terrible events of year 1944. And all those tribulations suffered by these people that from Russian aggression. Thank you very much, Mr. Sergei. If we get back to deportation of Meskhetian Turks to Stalin's regime, why did Stalin do it? And talking about today, how does the Putin's regime repeat those crimes? Well, deportation of Meskhetian Turks is an evidence that the arguments of Stalin's regime, where he was explaining the deportation by the cases of treasons, are absolute lies, because Meskhetian Turks were living in a territory that was never occupied by Nazi troops. And everything Stalin was doing back then, the task of all those things was to create safe platform for offensive against Turkey. This is when Stalin's plan on recreation of Russian Empire emerges. His plan to capture Turkish territories. Specifically, then Stalin exercised the repressions against the people who, in his opinion, could have contacts with Turkey. Let me remind you that Turkish-speaking peoples were repressed. Bulgarians were repressed, but they were the peoples that had contacts on that side of the border, that side of the Black Sea. And to create this platform for offensive on Turkey to cover their rears, Stalin's regime exercised that repression. This is why they committed that crime. And the Russian vile propaganda, there is no case that we can call any of that true. So it's an absolute evil that cannot be justified by any arguments. Thank you very much. Let me continue about the modern day, about how we've come to this topic, how we've got familiarized with how we met the Meskhetian community. Back in the year 2003, we were making our educational project called Islamic Communities in Ukraine, and we've covered all the Islamic communities in Crimea and mainland Ukrainians, and we were trying to find contacts with the Meskhetian communities. And in the area of Choklinka, we stopped by a man who was selling melons and watermelons. We started talking to him, and he said, "You've come to the right person." He said, "Come on, let's go. I'm gonna bring you to our imam." And this is how we met imam. That's another story, but more context and more interest to this topic obviously emerged after the year 2014, because our center focuses on the south of Ukraine and Kherson region specifically. Kherson region is a region where the most of the Meskhetian Turks used to live, as it was already mentioned. 9 to 10,000, as it was mentioned already. Unfortunately, we don't have exact details as of 24th of February 2022, because there was no census, but the community of Meskhetians was different for the expanded type of recreation. So just 5-6 years ago, they had 5 to 6 children in the family. That was a standard, and within the last 3 to 5 years, the number of children started decreasing to 4, 3, or 2, which is an interesting fact by itself. As Sadiyar has mentioned, you know, the invasion started when the community of Meskhetian Turks started its modernization. It just happens so that they are the people who work on land, the people who worked a lot on land. They are really very industrious people. We've done a lot of focus surveys in Chaplinka district of Kherson region, and I remember those phrases: if it's not for the Turks, we would forget how to grow the vegetables. So it takes a lot of manual work, and in Turkish family they all go in the field and they all work in families, with all their families in the field. And on the 24th of February, when people started getting machinery, when they started mechanizing their labor, when they started sending their children to universities, when there are clear signs of clear patterns of modernization, transition to life in cities, obtaining of education. We've witnessed the generation of children who perceive Kherson region and Chaplinka as their homeland, for whom Ukrainian language is native language. They perceive it just as Meskhetian Turkish language, just as they see Georgia as their homeland. So we've seen all those contributions made by the community to the development of the region. And after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I was making a survey about the peaceful resistance in Chaplinka, in other villages. And as you know, Kherson region is a leader in peaceful resistance. Text.org.ua created an infographics back in their day where they demonstrated the map of a number of protests. Such an infographics: after the Russian troops entered the city, people without arms were stopping them, and they said, "Go away." So Kherson region is the indisputable leader in this sense. Not because they're better, no, just because it just happened. So anywhere the Meskhetian Turks were used to live, there was such resistance. I was interviewing people in Chaplinka. They said, we went out on the protest. We never knew if the Meskhetian Turks would walk out with us, but I was walking shoulder to shoulder with the Meskhetian Turk. And we were crying all together, crying out loud, Russian battleship, go you know where. So when the peaceful resistance was rendered impossible, just like the majority of people in the East Bank, they started leaving. By different evaluations, now there is probably 1/3 of the population remains in occupation, 1/3 of that number that used to live there before the occupation, and probably 2/3 of the communities have just left to the European countries, to Turkey, to other parts of Ukraine, as it was already said. And what we find out today about the life of the communities that was forced to, or that was relocated to one of the northern provinces of Turkey, well, what we know is that the people want to come back. You know, it's not the first wave of the Meskhetian Turks live in Ukraine. In the year 2014, the village of Slavyanska ended up in the area of active battles. So they were living around Slavyansk, in Semenivka, in Chaplinka and Golopristan districts of Kherson region, along with Partizani. Well, I apologize for the old name. Yeah, in Henishevsk district, right? Thank you. And around Bashtanka in Mykolaiv region. In the year 14, the government of Turkey, in the background of that destruction, Semenivka ended up in the middle of the fights during liberation of Slavyansk, so it was almost completely destroyed. Well, upon the coordination with the Turkish government, about 2,000 Meskhetian Turks moved to Turkey. They were given homes there, and part of them came back to Ukraine. So now the situation is completely different, both in Ukraine and in Turkey. And those people living in Turkey now, they ended up in a situation of a refugee camp, in the plastic homes, without land, without work, without special any means of existence. And obviously the majority of them, after the liberation, wants to come back to Kherson region, or if it happens so, maybe even to Georgia. So the younger generations, they connect their future to, they tie their future to Ukraine, is their personal choice. Now, under the occupation in Chaplinka district, there are communities established. You know, when the majority has left, the small groups, in coordination with the Ukrainians, they were looking after the houses of their friends, demonstrating different forms of solidarity, looking after the homes of their families to make sure the Russians don't pillage them. And such examples, they are supposed to be described, they are supposed to be documented, because solidarity is our power. Solidarity is what we've demonstrated during the Revolution of Dignity, and since the very first days of the full-scale invasion. And our solidarity is one of the elements of the resilience of Ukrainian state. Thank you very much, Mr. Sadyar. Getting back to the 24th of February, please tell us how your community met the invasion and how they exercised resistance against the occupiers. Well, you know, that was 5 o'clock in the morning, everybody started calling each other, saying that the war has started, and our community of Meskhetian Turks that were living in Chaplinske, they call me and they say, look, there are many missiles coming your way that we can see. It was terrible, and on the very first day they were waiting for information from us, what to do next, and we were trying to give them some instructions that we were getting from our military administrations, municipal administrations, and many people, the students who were studying back then in the cities, you know, they were scared, they were asking what to do. But then on the second, third day, as Sergei has mentioned, many people walked out in protests, sending the Russians to follow their battleship, and then probably around a week afterwards they didn't know what to do. Nobody knew how the situation was about to develop, and we were saying that we have to wait a little bit to think about different options, what would be the following steps to take. Just like everybody, we were afraid. We were in the city, and believe me, we didn't even know what to do in that situation back then, because it's very difficult to remind yourself, like, I am a man, but I ended up in a difficult situation. Not only me, but our neighbors, our community, our citizens. Well, it was terrible, but telling something like within those 10 days, honestly, I don't even know how people made it through those first 10 days. I can only say that our community was resilient. We were waiting for the orders of our top level officials, and then part of them has left through Armyansk, through the assistance of Turkish authorities. They helped us to get organized in Armyansk, and then we got a bus that got us evacuated to an airfield, and then they've taken an airplane to Turkey. I think now it's about 2,000 of them over there. In Vashtanka and Mykolaiv there are about 10, maybe 15 families over there. I was in touch with them. In Chaplinka there are probably 6 to 7 families left. So this is the situation for the time being. Well, do you know anything about the lives of the Meskhetian Turks living in occupation? Because we know that Russia treats national minorities, diplomatically saying, with disrespect, but they treat people with disrespect generally. Well, it's a difficult question. You know, they used to live like in one place after the deportation. In Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, they were living there for 45 years. So somehow they got used to those conditions. And then once again, and within that period, you know, our people, just like during Soviet times, they were coming to Moscow, they were making meetings there to come back home. But then after the events in Fergan Valley, we started living in 9 regions. And then the USSR collapsed, and it has become even more difficult for us to get united, to ask for our rights to come to our homeland. And now, as the war had started, now we are not in 9 regions, but probably in 15 or 20 regions all across the world. And those who went to Turkey in year 22, they were living in May and June, so now they live there in containers, and now 1 year and a half has passed. So how can you live in a small container for a year and a half? You can only imagine the conditions. You know, some families have 2 or 3 kids, and they live like husband, a wife, then their elderly parents. So they live in the most difficult conditions now. And when we ask for help, when we ask for the support to come back to our homes, we cannot catch the agenda, so to say, because it's the war now. Before it was COVID, so people start forgetting about their culture, about the important things. They just think about being by the side of their kids, of their parents, their wives, to make some money, to make their kids rejoice somehow. So basically nobody died of hunger, but still the conditions of living are difficult. People are unable to see their loved ones. Some of them leave to Europe, so you know, those who left for Europe, with the Ukrainians, yes, in Europe they get some support, some help, they provide good conditions for living, but they are still not Ukraine. Those countries are not their home. We continue talking to our friends on the phone, whether they are Meskhetian Turks or Ukrainians, they all want to come back home. You know, home is something else, no matter how good is the place you stay at. So we are fatigued of being somewhere else. We all want to come back home. And I really want and I wish we win shortly and we are able to come back home. Well, we all wish for that. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions on the floor? Good afternoon, Nadia Yurshenko, Ukrinform. I would like to ask, how numerous is the Meskhetian Turks diaspora? How united are they? Is there any civil organization or a center that unites them? Also, you've mentioned that Meskhetian Turks are busy with their survival. Does it mean that they have lost their cultural identity or they were able to preserve it? Well, if you mean the diaspora all around the world, I think it's about 600,000 to 700,000. Talking? Well, the second question, I apologize. Oh, organization, yeah, right. Any organization. Yes, we have an international organization that represents us everywhere. It's called DATUB. We've established that civil organization in Turkey, and there is also Vatan, which is translated as homeland. They represent us in all of the supranational organizations, and they do a lot to make sure we come back to Turkey. They are in negotiations with the Georgian authorities regarding these matters, and also they do a lot for the Meskhetian Turks, no matter where they live, to make sure that their conditions of living are fit for living, so they enjoy their lives. Well, and talking about the culture, when people live in different conditions, when they don't live together, they become the minorities. After the second or third generation, they start gradually forgetting it, whether we want it or not, because some of the Meskhetian Turks live in Ukraine, and some live in Ukraine. Some live in Uzbekistan, some live in Russia. They attend the schools there, they attend kindergartens, universities, and little by little they absorb a little from other cultures and they start forgetting about theirs. So it's not only about Meskhetian Turks, but is the same problem for any diaspora, for any people living outside their homes. So thank you very much for your question, but we are going to ask for the support from Ukrainian government to help us in relations with Georgia to resume the negotiations so that they give us the right to come back to our lands, to our roots. There is a lot of rights that we can demand from them, but we don't want any conflicts with them. We don't want any disputes, because Georgian people are our brothers. We live 1,000 years side by side. We're not looking for any trouble, but please give us back what was taken from us, because in our cemeteries, I was visiting Georgia for a number of times. In those cemeteries where our great-grandfathers are buried, I apologize, but there are cows walking over their tombs, but it's our past, it's our history. So we hope that soon we will win and the world will help us to come back home. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm a Turkish journalist from Bayraktar. What you've mentioned about the majority of Meskhetian Turks in Turkey, I know that there were two waves of refugees from Ukraine to Turkey. First one was after the beginning of the hybrid war back in the years 2014-15, and another wave was after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And you've mentioned that those who left for Turkey last year now live in containers. So what is the situation with the refugees who left for Turkey in 2014? That's the first question. And another question is, what is the status of their relations with the local population, and what is their population compared to the Syrian refugees in Turkey? Thank you very much. It's a very important question. It's very interesting. If we segregate those waves, the first in year 2014-15, now they live very well. Turkey has provided them with all the rights that the local citizens are entitled to. So they were given homes, they were issued passports, the citizenship, they were provided with all the social benefits. The children and all of the people were getting medical aid in all areas. And Meskhetian Turks, who were coming with the second wave, now there is the first phase of construction of the homes is completed for them. About 1,000 of Meskhetian Turks will be provided with the new homes, and they will be further on supported. Turkey, I have to say that the Meskhetian Turks appreciate what Turkey has done for them, that they opened their doors and they covered all their necessities. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Do we have more time? Good afternoon. Maxim Mayorov. I represent the Center of Strategic Communications, and I know about the problems of Meskhetian Turks since 2014 because I was a part of the expedition to the place of their places of residence of Meskhetian Turks in Donetsk region. We were researching their conditions of living. So this is why I'm interested in this topic. So talking about the identity of Meskhetian Turks, we know that on top of those multiple tragedies that they were affected by during deportations, wars, they were unlucky. You know, even when they were coming to the new places of living, they became a parties to some conflicts, even from Fergan Valley they were coming to Chechnya or Karabakh. And unfortunately, this is exactly the case with Ukraine. And another problem of Meskhetian Turks is that frequently they were attempted to be imposed some alien identity. Sometimes they were attempted to be assigned to the Azerbaijan community in Georgia. Why this problem with repatriation to Georgia emerged? Because more than Georgia requires the Meskhetian Turks to abdicate their Turkish identity and recognize themselves as the Turkized Meskhetians, the Georgians, who were Islamized by Azerbaijan back in the day. So they require them even to accept the Georgian names, to change their real names. So talking about identity, I apologize for this protracted introduction. So since they live so long away from their homeland, from the main massive of Turkish people in a broad sense, Turkish who live both in Turkish and abroad. Based on your observation, probably is difficult to diagnose, but do you observe any changes of identity to develop the specific Meskhetian Turk identity? Do you perceive yourself as a separate people or representatives of a larger Turkish ethnic community? Thank you for this question. You know, it was interesting to me as well, and it's very difficult to answer. You know, in 2 sentences, it's almost impossible because we proceed to history here. The 1,000 years history tells us that we were living there for 1,000 years. Some were saying that we are Turkish, others say we're Azerbaijanis, the third ones say we're Georgians, but we, for ourselves, we know that we are a separate nation. You know, we perceive it like that. If you want a precise answer, I don't know the precise answer, honestly. I think that as soon as we come back to our homeland, let the necessary services who will be vested this responsibility to investigate this issue. For us, it doesn't make a difference. We just want to remain people and to come back home. Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. I wish our victory comes soon and the Meskhetian Turks community comes back home, no matter where this home is, whether in Ukraine or Georgia. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform will continue its operation tomorrow. Thank you for staying tuned. Thank you.